Hi, welcome back to my channel, Beautiful Minutia. If you're new here, my name is Tiffany, and today I'm going to be talking about all the books that I completed in the month of February. February was a bit of a weird month for me. It was fairly slumpy for the most part. I have a couple of gems in here, but even the books that I enjoyed, I feel like maybe I could have enjoyed them more if I hadn't been in such a slumpy mood. Part of my slump, I know, is coming off of a massive disappointment that I read in January, but in addition to that, we've had some family things happening and some stressful situations, which actually made me post a lot less in February as well. I had a community post where I talked about that and kind of what was going on a little bit. So I think that all of that culminated for this like perfect storm of me struggling with a decent amount of the books that I read, even if I had relatively positive experiences with them. So I'm going to talk about these books. There will be timestamps if you want to skip around, but here are the books I read. I'm going to start with my Febregency books. I did just post a Febregency reading vlog, and I will link that. You can go check that out if you want to hear more in-depth thoughts. And I also had a DNF in there that I'm not going to be talking about in this video. So I had a reread of Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen. And the original reason why I chose this book to read in February is I chose it for my British literature class during the month of February. And then that worked out perfectly with Febregency. And so that just ended up being perfect. I really enjoyed my reread of this, even though this was also a book that I also was struggling to get into and kind of had to like make myself read. And that's not any reflection on the book itself because I just love Jane Austen so much. Although I would say that this is in the bottom half of her like major 6 works for me, which is funny because it was my favorite in high school. And I think one of the reasons it was my favorite in high school is just because I love the sister relationships in Sense and Sensibility. I am one of 3 daughters, and so I have an older sister and a younger sister, and so I think that that's why the sister element speaks so deeply to me. But I really enjoyed rereading this. This is the time that I have dug the deepest into this book because I did a lot of research and a lot of analyzing so that way I could facilitate discussions in my class, and I think that that just only enriched my experience of rereading this. I also read for Febregency The Italian by Anne Radcliffe. This was a buddy read with Stephanie from Miss Richards Reads and Dia from Novel Idea. It's becoming a tradition for us to read something Regency together during February. This is only the 2nd year, but we're already making plans for next year, so I think it's becoming a tradition. This book was just fun. I think that under different circumstances, I could have seen this being a 5-star book, but it wasn't for me. It ended up being like 3.5 because I had a fun time with it, but I also feel like it wasn't that deep. It was just fun. So this is a story that is like super dramatic about these 2 people who fall in love in like this whirlwind romance, which is typically what happens in this era, kind of like a love at first sight kind of thing. And it seems like all the world is against their relationship, and there's some scheming and conniving and an evil priest slash monk, and that made this like so much fun. He was just such a great villain. I felt like the characters were what really shined the most in this story. I just really loved a lot of the supporting characters in particular, but I also really loved the female lead. So there was just a lot of fun, a lot of twists and turns, and plot twist after plot twist after plot twist, particularly in the last volume of this book because there's 3 volumes, and it was a good time. The last thing that I finished for Febregency is I have this collection of the romantic poets. And for the last couple of years, what I've tried to do during Febregency is choose a romantic poet that I've read less from or maybe nothing from. And so this year I chose Coleridge, and I hadn't read anything from him at all. So I read a chunk of his smaller poems, but then I also read The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, and my goodness, that was so fun. I actually listened to it on audio, which I highly recommend because it is a longer poem. I think in this book it's like 20 or 30 pages. Like, it's on the longer side. And I don't know about you, but I struggle to follow long form poetry and feel like I lose like the beauty of the rhyming scheme and all those things. So I love with longer poems to listen to them or to read them out loud. So I listened to this one, in the car on the way from dropping my husband off at the airport, and it was just so good. It's so like unsettling at times, creepy at times, has like some elements I didn't know were going to be in there at all. And even like the line water, water everywhere and not a drop to drink, I didn't know that came from Rime of the Ancient Mariner. So it was really fun to see several things that were in this poem that are referenced in pop culture that I had no idea originated here. Okay, let's move on to some other classics. I had a couple of other classics that I finished for book clubs or group reads this month. So one of those was Death Comes for the Archbishop by Willa Cather. If you're a patron, you already know how I feel about this because I did a long vlog. I do that once a month where I pick a book that's been recommended to me by one of my patrons and then do like a full spoilery vlog on Patreon. So I had several patrons that had read this book and thought that I would love it. And then it ended up getting chosen for my in-person book club for the month of February, so it was kind of like a win-win. This is a story of two priests who are from France, and they end up in New Mexico, kind of settling churches there. One of them is like becomes an archbishop, and death comes for him at the end of the book. It's kind of the story of their lives and their ministry in New Mexico. I thought that I was going to absolutely love this book because I love, love, love Willa Cather, but so far this is my least favorite thing of hers that I've read. And again, I'm willing to attribute that to slumpiness. I feel like maybe I would have given this a higher rating at a different time. But honestly, this book was so episodic, and that made it to where I felt kind of disconnected from the characters until we got to like the end like section of the book, because then we get the backstory of how these priests knew each other and their relationship, and then them going to France together. And I feel like maybe I would have been more invested if we had got that at the beginning, but we didn't. We got it at the end as the archbishop is reflecting on his life before he dies. And I do feel like there are so many things that this book did really, really well. Like, I absolutely love Cather's treatment of the Native people in this book. I feel like she does a really interesting thing examining the intersection of Catholicism with the Native pagan religions where these priests come to, whether that be Native American tribes that are living in New Mexico or just the Mexican people and their traditions and like pagan beliefs and stuff, and how those things can become intermixed and play off of each other, which actually reminded me quite a bit of Kristen Lavrenstatter, which I read last year because I felt like that had some interesting conversations with that as well, even though it's a totally different setting, different time period, all those things. So there were some really good things in this book, and I really love how this book treated death and reflection on your life and what does it mean to live your life well. And so there were really good things about it. But again, I felt like it was really disconnected, and some of the stories, like the vignettes of things that they were doing as they're traveling around, as they're visiting these different dioceses, I don't know if that's the right word, as they're traveling around and all these things, some of the stories felt like they built on some of the themes that Cather was addressing, and some of them didn't. And so as a result, there were moments where I felt like you could have put any anecdote or story in this section and it wouldn't have changed anything about the book. And so it made me feel kind of like I said, disconnected and just not very interested in the story as a whole. I feel like an absolute traitor for not adoring a Willa Cather book, but this just wasn't a favorite for me. For our Patreon group read this month, we read The Black Tulip by Alexandre Dumas, and we actually haven't even had our discussion for this yet. The discussion will be like after this video comes out. So if you're a patron, here's the sneak peek of what I think, but we'll talk more about this later. This is a story of a man who is like really obsessed with tulip growing during the tulip mania, which was happening in Holland, and I didn't even know like anything about that. I didn't even know that was a thing. It was so interesting, the historical components of this book, as well as some of like the political intrigue, because he finds himself embroiled in this plot and implicated in something and then wrongfully imprisoned as a result of that. A lot of the characters, like there's like kind of there's some assassinations and like things that happen at the beginning of the book that all involve like real historical figures. That was really interesting and far more brutal than I anticipated. So it was interesting. The setting was really interesting at the beginning. I was like really like honed in. I was like, oh my gosh, like this is so interesting. And then it kind of dropped off for me a little bit. which again, I feel like is because I was slumpy. But I really loved the writing in this book. There are times where like Dumas like breaks the fourth wall. I love it when authors do that. He's talking to the reader specifically, and it's just like so there were real moments of like dialogue that were funny or that were very insightful. And so I really enjoyed the writing style of this, and I felt like it was a really fun book. On my Discord, Penny said that it felt like a Wile E. Coyote and Roadrunner story mixed with historical fiction. And oddly, that's so accurate because it feels like the villain is totally like this Wile E. Coyote, where he's got all these schemes and these elaborate things that he's doing, but like everyone can see what he's doing and no one is fooled by him and like all this stuff. And it's like, and it's also very obvious to the reader what's going to happen. Like, I didn't feel like this was twisty or turny. I felt like it was super predictable, but it was really fun. Like, it wasn't life-changing, but I still had a fun time reading it. Moving on to the one nonfiction that I completed in the month of February, I still am in the process of reading Patriot by Alexei Navalny. So I'm not going to talk about that, but I am creeping up on the halfway point with that one. But I did finish a book that you can't even see what it is because this is faded and there's nothing on here. So I could be lying to you when I tell you this is The Four Loves by C.S. Lewis, but I'm not. It is The Four Loves, but you would have no idea. Anyways, I finished this book. I really wanted to read it in February because Valentine's Day, month of love, all that kind of stuff. And I enjoyed this. So C.S. Lewis starts with talking about different types of love, like the kinds of love that we have as humans and how they fall into two categories: gift love, where you're giving of yourself, and then need love, where you're receiving things that you need from a loving relationship. He then goes on to talk about 4 different types of love. So he talks about affection, which is commonly like found in parental relationships. He talks about friendship. He talks about eros, which is like the romantic relationship. And then he finishes with charity, which is like the love of God. He talks about how all those fit in those categories and like explores his own thoughts and feelings on those types of love. And I found so much of this book to be really, really good, but there were things that I was just kind of like, okay, I'm really not sure where you're getting that or where you're going with this. And so there were things about it that I didn't agree with or didn't enjoy, and I felt like he was a bit long-winded in some of his sections, but his final section on charity was like a 10-star section. Even on a scale from 1 to 5 stars, it was 10 stars. It was so good. So it was so worth reading, and I'm so glad that I did. It was really good. I took like the whole month to read it and read it very slowly. The next book I'm going to talk about is sci-fi slash maybe horror. I see it sometimes classified as horror. That's Authority by Jeff Vandermeer. This is book 2 in his Southern Reach series. And I read book 1, Annihilation, in January. And when I tell you, I was obsessed with this book. I was obsessed. Like, I was not expecting that. It's a super weird book, and so is this one, honestly. But I was up till like 1:30 in the morning because I had to know what happened, and I read the whole book in less than 24 hours, which, I mean, it's less than 200 pages. It's a short book. So that part's not impressive, but I like just couldn't put it down. So I immediately went to the library and got the next 2 books in the series. And so I read Authority in the month of February, and I struggled with this. Part of that, again, is probably because I was slumpy, but part of it is that we have completely switched gears. So in the first book, we're following this biologist who isn't even given a name, and she's going into this like territory that they're trying to explore and find more out about, and it's really weird, and you don't know what's real and what's not real. And then in book 2, we pull out of that entirely, and we instead follow someone who is in control of the research center where they're sending these expeditions into this area, and they're analyzing the data and they're making these decisions, and he's the new director there. And so it's a totally different perspective. We're outside of this area, and we have a totally different like narrator and person that we're following. So I still ended up enjoying it to an extent. There's definitely this feeling of unease. You still have moments where you're like, what is going on? And like, is this even real? Is he imagining this, or is this real? There's like this definitely like feeling of like surrealness to it. It took me a really long time to get into this book, and I think it took me like 2 weeks to finish it. And like it's longer than the first book, but it's not that long. I think it's a little over 300 pages, so it's not super long. The ending of this was really good though. Like the way that it culminated was really good. And then like the very last like paragraph, I'm like, well, now I gotta read book 3. I also read, I guess maybe this is literary fiction. I don't know. So one of my favorite books of the year last year was Small Things Like These by Claire Keegan. And in February, I picked up Foster, which is another novella of hers. This one follows a young girl who is part of a large family that can't really care for her. And so for this summer, she's being sent to these distant relatives who are there to like take care of her because her family like needs some help. This was my favorite book of the month. By far, this was like 10,000 stars, like 5 stars. This is going to probably be one of my favorites of the year. And I actually sat down and read this in one setting, which is not impressive. It's 80 pages long. But this was the one book that I read in February that I just like consumed, that I loved every second of, that I was so drawn into, that I just like absolutely 10,000% adored. It's a hard read at times because you're dealing with a child who hasn't been loved the way that a child should, hasn't received attention the way that a child should. But at its core, this is a book about what it means to love and how that love changes things, because that love changes a little girl, but that love also changes the people who are caring for her. And so it's a quiet little book. It's not like plot heavy at all. It's just like really, really beautifully, beautifully written. And when I finished this book, I was a puddle of tears. The last book that I'm going to talk about is Middle Grade, and I'm not going to talk about it in depth because this is going to be in a vlog that will be coming to you sometime in March, because I am reading through all the Newbery nominees and the winner. And so I actually started this in February because I needed a new audiobook. So I listened to Across So Many Seas by Ruth Behar. This is a multi-generational story. And so we start with this young girl who is being displaced in 1492 from Spain. She's part of a Jewish family. And during 1492, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella gave an ultimatum to all the Jews within their country that they needed to convert, or they needed to leave, or they would be killed. And so this girl and her family decide to flee to Turkey. Then we skip ahead to a few hundred years to one of her descendants who ends up being sent from Turkey to Cuba, and then that woman's daughter who is sent from Cuba to the United States. And then we end with like that woman's daughter with her mother and grandmother who are visiting Spain and getting some of like this historical context of the first woman in the story. So the whole thing kind of comes full circle, but very much it's a story of displacement and identity, and poetry and music play a huge role that transcends all 4 narratives in a really, really beautiful way. We have this traditional Jewish song that carries throughout, and listening to it was wonderful because they sang the song for every single thing. And so it was just like really, really beautiful. And there is also like this musical instrument called the oud that is passed down from generation to generation, and girls playing it and teaching their daughters how to play it. And there's just like, it was really, really well done. And I really, really enjoyed it. So those are all the books that I read in February. I really wish that I had had like a stellar reading month because I had a lot of books that I was really excited about, and they just didn't quite carry through for me, except for Foster. Foster was an absolute slam dunk, and I loved every single second of it. I'd love to hear from you in the comments down below. If you've read any of the books I talked about here, I would love to chat with you about that, and I would love to hear what is your favorite book that you read during the month of February. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, please hit like and also subscribe so you can continue to see more bookish content from me. And I will see you again next time.